Imagine for a moment that you entrust your life and soul to someone who seems to be the personification of goodness. The pastor of your church, the one who guides your faith, advises in difficult moments, and above all, seems to be the model of morality. Now, what if I told you that this man, this spiritual leader, has a deadly secret? And worse, what goes on inside the mind of such an admired man that drives him to commit something so unthinkable? Get ready for the truth that will leave you speechless, because what you're about to hear will shake everything you believed about trust and faith. Jonathan Parker, the town's pastor, a man with so many loyal followers, was, in fact, a calculated murderer. Surprised? Well, the story you're about to hear challenges everything you know about morality, what it means to be a leader, and even what's possible inside the human mind. Here's the turning point. The real monsters aren't always the ones you expect. They don't have sharp claws or scary faces. They use sweet words and wear the clothes of faith. The quick reward. You'll understand how, as impossible as it may seem, anyone can be capable of the unthinkable. And yes, you'll find out how Jonathan Parker managed to escape being exposed for so long, and how he did it until he was finally caught. Stay tuned, because the truth is much darker than you can imagine. In a small town in Florida, with only 2,000 inhabitants, everyone knew each other's name. Life there was peaceful, as if time passed slower, and a sense of security prevailed. People left their doors unlocked and keys in their cars, fully trusting one another. Imagine a place where you can walk barefoot down the street at night and still feel safe. This town had something special, something you don't see in big cities. But as you know, even the most peaceful places have their secrets. The community was so united that everyone felt like one big family. In this town, trust was the invisible thread that connected all the residents until something would break that harmony. But what would happen when that trust was tested? What would happen when the man you trust the most, someone who preaches about morality, might be responsible for an unimaginable crime? Now imagine being at the center of all this, a quiet town where everything seemed normal until that night, but something was wrong, something very wrong. And that's where Jonathan Parker's story begins to take on a shadow no one expected. He had become a leader in the town, someone everyone trusted, but did he deserve that trust? Something was brewing to come to light, and no one could have imagined what was really happening. Jonathan Parker was more than just a simple religious leader. He was a master of communication, someone capable of touching the soul of anyone who listened to him. His words were like music to the ears of his congregation, and his ability to engage people made everyone feel special. When he stood at the pulpit, it was as if time stopped. His messages were deep, inspiring, and above all, made everyone in the room feel that he was speaking directly to them. He knew how to connect. He wasn't just a preacher. Jonathan was a mentor, a figure to be followed, someone people saw as an example of life to be imitated. The respect for him went beyond words. People trusted him, believed in him. He knew what to say and when to say it, and above all, he knew how to make people believe that he was there to help them, to guide them. Everything seemed perfect. What no one knew, however, was that behind that welcoming smile and those moving sermons, there was something much more sinister. But when it comes to trust, the question is always the same. How far would Jonathan Parker go to keep his secret? He wasn't just a dedicated pastor, but someone capable of manipulating emotions, someone who could create a facade of purity while hiding something much darker. The truth was about to be revealed, and the things he was willing to do to protect his facade would be more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Everything seemed normal until that night, but something was wrong. Something very wrong. Janet Tillman, Jonathan's wife, was found dead in their home after a tragic shooting accident. What seemed like a simple, ordinary night turned into a nightmare. Jonathan's explanation was that the shot occurred while he and Janet were storing the guns used in a church charity event. But even with the lament in his voice, something in the air felt out of place. The community was devastated. They knew Jonathan as a God-fearing man, someone who inspired trust. So what was wrong with the situation? The initial investigations found nothing suspicious. Jonathan was distraught, as anyone would be after the death of a spouse. However, as the days passed, Jonathan's mourning seemed to grow emptier, and questions questions began to arise. How could the shot be so fatal? Why was he handling the guns in such a suspicious manner? And why did he seem more concerned with his own image than with the suffering of the wife who had lost her life? When the police began to dig deeper, small inconsistencies started to emerge, and soon the story behind the incident seemed to have more layers than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation progressed, the details didn't make sense. Jonathan kept lying about the events, changing his versions of the facts. The truth didn't seem to fit anywhere. How far would Jonathan Parker go to hide his sins? What he did wasn't just a mistake. It was a nightmare that could happen to any of us. What was he willing to do to keep his facade intact? More than ever, the community found itself divided between the pain of the loss and the growing suspicion that there was something much more sinister behind it all. The news of Janet Tillman's death shook the small town to its core. The sense of security that everyone shared was broken irreparably. Jonathan was, for many, the central figure of the church, the leader everyone admired. The shock was immediate. How could the man everyone trusted be involved in something so horrible? The entire community was in mourning, but also in doubt. What really happened that night? Why did Jonathan seem to be hiding something? As pain and confusion took over, the police were called to investigate, but answers didn't come right away. The first days after Janet's death were marked by a cautious but unhurried investigation. The police questioned Jonathan, but there was no solid evidence to contest his version. He seemed genuinely devastated, and his explanation, though strange, seemed plausible at first. But the truth didn't make sense, and Jonathan kept lying, and the police knew he was hiding something. The feeling that something was wrong only grew as more details about the case emerged. But the question remained, what was he willing to do to keep his secret? As time passed, more inconsistencies began to accumulate. Jonathan's versions of what happened that night didn't fit, and the police knew that no matter how much he tried to hide the truth, something was out of place. The town was divided. On one side, there were those who still believed in Jonathan, and on the other, those who began to question everything he represented. It was impossible to ignore the suspicions. Was Jonathan Parker really telling the truth, or was there a much darker story lurking, waiting to be revealed? As the investigation deepened, the police made a startling discovery. Jonathan Tillman, the man everyone thought they knew, had changed his name to Timothy Patrick McNally shortly before the death of his wife, Janet. This raised a red flag. Why would someone who seemed to be a person of faith and integrity change their name? What was he trying to hide? This discovery completely changed the direction of the investigation. Up until that moment, everyone had seen Jonathan as a man of God, someone you could trust, but this new name seemed to be the beginning of a labyrinth of secrets. The truth was starting to emerge, but not clearly just yet. The investigators began to wonder what else might be hidden. Identity changes are not common, and even less so when someone is trying to start a new life in a small, peaceful town. The connection to the name McNally deepened as authorities discovered that Jonathan had not only changed his name, but also tried to erase traces of a troubled past. What no one knew about Jonathan Parker might terrify you. Suddenly, the signs were pointing to something much darker, something the town still couldn't process. The respected pastor everyone followed had more to hide than they could have imagined, and then the investigation began to reveal more secrets. As the police dug deeper, Jonathan's history came to light, and the truth no longer seemed so far off. Jonathan, or rather Timothy McNally, had a past of unresolved crimes, including accusations of inappropriate behavior and a history of deceit. But how did this connect to Janet's death? Jonathan's story was falling apart. He was not the man everyone believed. He was a calculated murderer. And now, no one was safe anymore. Where there were lies, there was also something far more deadly, a secret he would try to take to the grave. The truth about Jonathan Tillman's, or Timothy McNally, past began to slowly unfold, and the layers of dark secrets unraveled one by one. The police discovered that long before becoming the respected pastor in the small town in Florida, Jonathan had a criminal history. He had been expelled from his ministry in several other cities for inappropriate behavior and even for having an affair with a woman from his congregation. This side of Jonathan seemed well hidden, but investigators soon realized he wasn't just running away from an identity, but from a past full of mistakes and failures that he didn't want anyone to know about. As the layers began to peel away, it became clear he was not who he claimed to be. And this troubled past wasn't just limited to romantic affairs. In one of the cities he had lived in, Jonathan was arrested after an incident involving a prostitute being convicted of a sexual assault. This alone was shocking, but for those who knew him only as the charismatic pastor and leader of a God-fearing community, it was impossible to believe. He had been expelled from multiple places due to conduct issues, and after each scandal, he would move to a new city. No one knew that the man preaching about salvation had a deadly secret. However, now, this secret was about to destroy his impeccable pastor facade. As Jonathan's past unraveled, the questions multiplied. How could a man with so many flaws and a history of problematic behavior become a pastor? The answer seemed simpler than anyone imagined: manipulation. Jonathan knew how to play the game. He knew how to present himself as the perfect person, someone everyone could trust. And for a long time, he managed to deceive everyone. Now, however, the truth was coming out in a way no one could have predicted. How far would Jonathan Parker go to hide his sins? What he did isn't just a crime, it's a nightmare that could happen to any one of us. After Janet Tillman's death, her family began to notice what many had ignored. Although the pain of the loss was immense, there was something else starting to deeply bother her loved ones. Jonathan, with his version of the story, was not convincing anyone, and his behavior was becoming increasingly suspicious. Janet had been a woman loved by all, someone who would hardly make anyone doubt her sincerity. But the signs that her death might not have been accidental were becoming clearer. Janet's family, being closer to her everyday life, was starting to see that Jonathan was not the person everyone thought he was. And that's when the real investigation began. Suspicions deepened when they started uncovering Jonathan's strange behavior after his wife's death. He seemed more concerned about his own image and what the community would think of him than with grieving the loss of Janet. His moments of sadness seemed forced, and what stood out the most was how he tried to manipulate others' perception of the event. Janet's family believed something was being hidden, and with that, they pressured the authorities to investigate thoroughly. They knew the truth didn't fit the story Jonathan was telling. Soon, they discovered that the facade of the faithful pastor was in complete contrast with who he truly was. From that point on, the investigation intensified. Janet's family no longer trusted Jonathan and felt an unsettling sense that he was hiding something. The more they dug, the more Jonathan's walls began to crumble. What started as a simple questioning case soon transformed into something much darker. The possibility that he was involved in his wife's death was no longer a doubt. It was becoming undeniable truth. What did Jonathan think he could do to cover his tracks? Could he maintain his facade as a faithful husband and pastor, or was he facing a judgment from which he couldn't escape? The truth finally began to emerge, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. A new layer of Jonathan Tillman's secrets was unearthed, and it was even more disturbing than anything the police had found so far. During the investigation, it became clear that he was not only hiding his true identity, but also had an affair with a woman named Molly. The secret relationship, which lasted for months, was discovered when authorities began to closely examine his personal communication. Molly believed that Jonathan was a different man. He told her he was a Navy officer, an elite commander, someone involved in secret missions. And as if that wasn't enough to feed the story, he also told her how unhappy he was in his marriage and the difficulties he faced with Janet. The discovery of the affair with Molly revealed an even darker side of Jonathan. He had managed to deceive not only the entire town, but also the woman he was having an affair with. He manipulated Molly into believing a life story he had created. And to make it even more convincing, Jonathan made Molly believe that Janet was in some kind of domestic accident that justified her temporary absence. What Molly didn't know, and what many in town also ignored, was that he was living two completely different lives. One as the respected pastor, and another as the man who lied, manipulated, and now, probably, was involved in a murder. Now, Jonathan's case wasn't just a story of infidelity. He had deceived his wife but also manipulated a woman who believed his lie. The relationship with Molly wasn't just a mistake of a married man. It was a key piece in the puzzle that would lead to the truth about Janet's death. What was he willing to do to keep this secret? How far would he go to protect the life he built on lies? And what would Molly do when she found out that the man she was falling in love with wasn't who she thought he was? How did all of this fit into Janet's story? The revelation of Jonathan's extramarital affair was the first step toward the web of lies that was about to collapse. After weeks of investigation, the police finally made a breakthrough. Jonathan Tillman, now under suspicion for his involvement in the murder of his wife Janet, was arrested for document forgery. However, that was just the beginning. During the interrogation, the investigators began to tighten the pressure, trying to uncover the true story behind Janet's death. Jonathan, with his usual manipulative behavior, tried to remain calm, but the inconsistencies in his responses were becoming more and more evident. As they pushed him further, he began to contradict himself, providing different versions of how the shooting occurred. He claimed the gunshot was an accident, but the gaps in his story were too large to be ignored. The police knew Jonathan was trying to deceive everyone. He wasn't just lying about the incident with the weapon, he was also lying about many other aspects of his life, such as his past and relationships. The questions grew sharper, and Jonathan, no matter how much he tried to keep his composure, couldn't prevent his lies from starting to crumble. And then the truth came out. But not in the way you might think. He wasn't just a pastor, he was a calculating murderer, and now no one was safe anymore. The moment he began to lose control, the investigators were ready to expose him. The truth he had tried to hide for so long was about to be revealed. The interrogation was a psychological game. The investigators knew Jonathan was sinking deeper into his lies, and the fact that he tried to stay composed only highlighted how desperate he was to preserve the image of a good-hearted pastor. The pressure was intense, and as he became more agitated, the police knew the net was closing in. Jonathan tried to escape in every possible way, but it was clear that his facade as a good man was disintegrating before the eyes of justice. He couldn't maintain control. His deadly secret was exposed. After a tense trial, where the evidence against Jonathan Tillman piled up, the truth finally came to light in an undeniable way. The court heard the witnesses, analyzed the evidence, and even with Jonathan's defense trying to maintain his innocence, it became clear that he was not just a pastor involved in a tragic accident, but a cold and calculating murderer. During the trial, he was confronted with his manipulation, his lies, and the extramarital affair he had tried to conceal. The defense tried to argue that Janet's death was an accident, but the inconsistencies in Jonathan's versions and the evidence presented by the prosecution left no room for doubt. It was now clear Jonathan Tillman premeditatedly killed his wife. The sentencing was a moment of relief for the community, which was still recovering from the shock caused by Janet's death. Justice had been served, but the cost was high. The pain of loss would never fully heal, but at least the truth was brought to light, and Jonathan would be held accountable for the crime he committed. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What he did wasn't just a crime, it was a nightmare that could happen to any one of us, especially when someone you trust the most reveals they are capable of such cruelty. Jonathan could no longer escape the reality of his actions. The trial brought a sense of closure, but also a somber warning about appearances. How did Jonathan manage to deceive so many people for so long, just to hide a life of lies and crimes? The community, devastated by Janet's loss, finally began to heal. Jonathan Tillman, the pastor who had once been the central figure of the town, was now just a reminder that even the most trusted individuals can hide deadly secrets. And in the end, justice was served. Janet finally got her justice, and the town learned, in the hardest way, the lesson that not everything is as it seemed.